History Association. Very pleased that you can be with us this evening. I'm William, I'm the Secretary of the Association. It is my great privilege to welcome our speaker for this evening, Justine Brown.
Good evening.
Justine was born in Vancouver in Canada. She now lives in England. She holds a Master's in Renaissance English Literature from the University of Toronto. This is where she developed a deep love for the history of the 16th and 17th century and for the culture of the 16th and 17th century. Her early books explore the problem of utopianism, and her current research now focuses on the Stuart dynasty. The book on which her talk is based this evening, The Private Life of James II, was published in 2024, and she has an upcoming book on Mary of Modena, which is due to be published in November of this year. She also has produced video series on the English Civil Wars and on the Jacobites, and those are available on her YouTube channel, Justine Brown's Bookshelf. Both of her books are available from Pen and Sword. So without further ado, welcome Justine, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me. Very happy to be here with you all. And today I want to drill down a bit into an aspect of what I cover in the book, The Private Life of James II, which is James's conversion. So I'm making an odd proposal here, which hopefully will make sense in time, that it was Henry VIII who made a Catholic out of James II. So James, the last Catholic monarch of England, Scotland, and Ireland, has been swept under history's carpet, and there is a reason for that. It is that our present Whig historical order depends upon his dethronement in the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688. So tonight I want to sketch out the shape of his life, just to make sure that we all are on the same page, because people have varying knowledge about James's life, and then focus in on the thinking that led to his very consequential religious conversion, which, by the way, happened before he became king, when he was Duke of York. So it happened actually about 15 years before he became King of England and Scotland and Ireland. So James's dates are 1633 to 1701. Born Duke of York, one of 5 surviving offspring of Charles I, who's pictured here in a painting by Lely, an early painting of Sir Peter Lely, which was done when the two were actually imprisoned, but normally they were imprisoned at different places, but they were allowed to visit each other sometimes. And we have here James when he's about 14 years old. I've never quite worked out what is going on with what he's handing to his father here, but a beautiful poem was written about this painting in which James is described as the true eaglet. So he's really his father's son. So his father is Charles I. His mother is the Bourbon princess Henrietta Maria. And James enjoyed a golden childhood during his father's period of personal rule, known to the king's Puritan enemies as the 11-year tyranny. Bit of a gap in perception there. But certainly Edward Hyde, when he wrote about the history of the rebellion, characterized this as an era of peace. Of course, those who felt that Parliament should have been more involved were not happy with this. With the advent of war between royalists and a zealous faction of Parliament, I want to stress that people always, when it comes to the English Civil War, people talk about, the king versus Parliament, but it's only ever a part of Parliament. And there was a large part of Parliament, the royalists, the MPs and lords that did not support, deposing the king or robbing him of his power, and of course they also set up a rival parliament in in Oxford, which is a fascinating topic in and of itself, that we had these kind of mirror world parliaments. But things fell dramatically apart for James and his family members once war broke out. He had a front row seat for the English Civil Wars, which some now call the British Civil Wars, or the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. When Oliver Cromwell's forces triumphed, James and his father were, as I mentioned, each imprisoned separately. And at his father's urging, the 14-year-old Duke escaped to the continent. He was actually dressed as a young lady um, to join his mother, Henrietta Maria. And James, of course, suffered greatly when he learned of his father's execution in 1649, as did the whole family and the supporters. And I think the shock of this, was incredible. I mean, now we've become unfortunately, a little more accustomed to, the idea of a decapitated monarch. But at the time, especially when the sort of body politic, literally the king was the head of the body politic. This was something really unthinkable, and just, and the you know yes, arguably Mary Queen of Scots was decapitated, but she wasn't in power at the time. Uh, we can argue that her execution actually made Charles I's execution thinkable. But this is something that is, we've had wars between monarchs, but very seldom have we seen a portion um, of the populace actually formally execute the king like that. So very hard to fathom. So when they decapitated Charles I, the revolutionary Puritans were also quite intentionally decapitated the traditional order. And my feeling is that we have never fully recovered from that severance of the oak tree. At the time, James was serving his brother's cause in France and in Flanders. I believe he was in France when he heard of the execution. Eventually, in 1660, the Stuarts were returned to power. Here we have a artist's rendition how this might have looked, but it was all, everybody says it was a very joyful day. But it's, if people ask me, what event in history would you most like to have witnessed? And I think I would have loved to be there for the day that Charles and James here would have been. This I think represents James at his side. Would have ridden back into London. Charles White riding a white horse that had been provided for him by a former enemy, Sir Thomas Fairfax, and just the May 29th was Charles's birthday, and you know maypole, the largest maypole imaginable, re-erected in London, and sort of representing this kind of old Merry England kind of dimension that had been scrubbed away under Cromwell and company. So they re-entered Whitehall in glory, but at Parliament's behest, it should be said, and that does tell us something, which is that there was still that kind of insistence that it really Parliament should be the one to decide here. But it must be said that the restoration was a splendid one for James, at least in worldly terms. He was immensely popular. He was a tall, handsome warrior in an era when the warrior caste were still in power, a Lord High Admiral who, as Samuel Pepys tells us, energetically led the fight against the fire of London. He was first in line to the throne, since Charles II had no children with his Portuguese queen, Catherine of Braganza. He did, however, have plenty of illegitimate offspring, about 14, I believe, in all. And one of these, the Duke of Monmouth, would create considerable problems for him and for James, becoming involved in rebellion more than once. And of course, people will know about the Monmouth Rebellion in 1685. But there were several incidents that happened before that. James married his sister Mary's maid of honor, Anne Hyde, in 1660. She gave him a son who died. Actually, I think there were two sons who died, and two daughters, Mary and Anne, and more of these two later. The marriage was considered ill-advised, but it was a success in personal terms, though this did not stop James from indulging himself in plenty of mistresses. Things were humming along for James, Duke of York, until he converted to Catholicism circa 1670. This spiritual sea change in the heir to the throne triggered years of political turbulence as a large faction of Parliament tried to shake him off. So at this time, we had the emergence of the Whig and Tory party system, and it cannot be stressed enough that this party system emerged in relation to James. The Whigs were his detractors, and the Tories were his supporters. And I'll go into that a bit more later. Um, Still, James peacefully succeeded Charles II in 1685. Here he is painted by Lely. He was, however, deposed in 1688, that glorious revolution, or inglorious revolution, as I like to call it, and in 1690 fought in Ireland to regain the throne unsuccessfully. The Battle of the Boyne is seen as decisive in the conflict, although there were several battles afterwards. His is the Jacobite cause, as James is Jacobus in Latin. In the public imagination, Jacobitism equals Bonnie Prince Charlie, but it originated with the prince's grandfather, our King James here. The public absorb a great deal of information about our very own Bluebeard, Henry VIII, in school and through a huge number of familiar vehicles, books, films, the Tudors, the Wolf Hall series, etc. And although Henry VIII became a tyrant, he is presented to us as the iconic English king. James, on the other hand, is shrugged off or vilified because our current order is founded upon his being deposed. His overthrow by his nephew and son-in-law, William of Orange, here at left, and the husband of James's Protestant daughter, Mary, and aided by elite officers like the unreliable John Churchill, who became the Duke of Marlborough, a young man whose career James made, and he was betrayed by him. In standard history courses, James is dismissed. Okay? So people, the impression we get is, oh, and then there was James II as an afterthought. He was a Catholic, and obviously that couldn't stand. So moving along, that's how James II was presented to me when I was in the first year of uni. The fact is that the Glorious Revolution is still politically sensitive today, and not least because of the implications it had down the line for Scotland and Ireland, where James had a lot of political support. This political sensitivity accounts for the miasma that hangs over James and his heir, Prince James Francis Edward Stuart, pictured here with a dog, the emblem of loyalty. Imagine this is a King Charles Spaniel or something similar. And little Prince James Francis Edward Stuart was painted by Sir Godfrey Kneller, who later tells us that he had, people may know that there were people tried to argue that this baby was a changeling, but Kneller always said, I know every corner of his parents' faces, having painted them many times, and this child was definitely theirs. Whig propaganda produced the tale of the changeling warming pan baby, and Whig history still generates a cloud of uncertainty around this most legitimate of princelings. And if you think about it, he has so many different names, many of them disrespectful associated with him. The old pretender to his enemies. He was the chevalier or the knight of St. George to his friends. He is James III and eighth to Jacobites. But because his birth was so threw the Whigs and others into such a panic at the prospect of a Catholic dynasty, there has been a huge effort to use propaganda to obscure him because this is, this is your king, actually, right? But nobody, average people don't know a lot about him. So we still have this cloud of uncertainty. The, Today, the power that Parliament gained in 1688 to 89 was further intensified when the Hanoverian George I succeeded Queen Anne in 1714, and this young prince was completely excluded from the line, along with about 50 other people who had a better claim to the throne, but since they were all Catholic, they were excluded. Sovereignty, in contention since the English Civil Wars, passed decisively from king to parliament, and the monarch became a mere figurehead. And indeed, the king is a royal, but I would argue not a monarch, since he does not actually rule. We don't have the rule of one. James II's embrace of the faith of his ancestors was a key factor in his fall from the throne. Not the only one, but crucial nonetheless. So, what spurred this metamorphosis in James? Researching rather, the private life of James II, I learned that the answer lies in his encounter with Henry VIII in the pages of a book on the English Reformation. James read this book covering Henry's life and his pivotal religious policy in about 1669, the year, incidentally, that his mother died, which may have been a contributing factor making him more introspective. He became quite preoccupied with the actions of that Tudor monarch from the preceding century. James's mental struggle with Henry VIII transformed him from an Anglican into a Catholic. James's here's James in his, actually, he was painted by one of Mary of Modena's maids of honor, who was a lady called Anne Killigrew, and she was very quite a skilled young lady. Unfortunately, she died young, or I think she would have become quite an excellent painter. So here are Charles I and Henrietta Maria, painted by the great Van Dyck. So Charles I was, of course, an Anglican, and Henrietta Maria was a Catholic. Before Henrietta Maria came to England, she received the Order of the Golden Rose from Urban VIII, a very important honor. And the Pope gave the young woman a mission to defend the interests of English and Irish Catholics. She did so with vigor, and this made her immensely unpopular with the Puritan faction. She did make certain efforts to convert her children, and she did make some converts at court, but only the youngest, Princess Henrietta Anne, was actually raised Catholic. By this time, Henrietta Maria was in exile, so she had more freedom in that regard. The young Charles II was concerned about her efforts to convert his siblings because it could disturb their Anglican followers when they were in this very fragile position in exile, and give the Puritans a weapon against the Stuarts. But as for James, it doesn't seem like his mother made much headway with him at this early stage, though he does mention a few different incidents on the continent where he respects and kind of admires certain things about the Catholic faith. But he identified very closely with his father, and he knew Charles believed himself a martyr to the Anglican Church. Now, it should be noted, however, that the king's efforts to preserve the episcopate also made an eventual reunion between the English communion and Rome possible. So as long as there were bishops, the structure of the church made it possible for the two to reunite, something that the Puritans were well aware of, and they wanted to get rid of that very thing. And Charles did correspond with the Pope to that effect. But as long as this bridge linking Anglicanism to the apostolic succession remained, England might become Catholic once more. In the late 1660s, James spent the better part of the decade savoring the restoration of his brother, Charles II. He had been laboring hard as the head of the Royal Navy, but he also played relentlessly, indulging himself strenuously in his chief vice. In James's own words, this was, quote, the forbidden love of women, unquote. This aspect of James's private life might seem frivolous, but it goes to the core of the matter. The personal lives of kings are always relevant in a sense because they can affect our his subjects directly. Of course, certainly when it comes to marriage, but also mistresses can also have an effect, especially with the birth of illegitimate contenders. We can go further in the case of James II. I want to show you how the philandering and his conscious and guilty conscience helped to drive his conversion and how it shadowed his life even after he had renounced fornication, the vice he shared with his famously hedonistic Merry Monarch brother and fellow cavaliers. An extreme case of this is the notorious Earl of Rochester. So here's an artist's impression of this kind of carry on. As Bishop Gilbert Burnet put it, they, quote, delivered themselves to a mad range of pleasures. Key point is that these enjoyments had a political benefit for the king and his companions, and so self-indulgence could be comfortably rationalized because hedonism punished the Cavaliers' enemies, the Puritan Roundheads who had executed Charles I in 1649. And here is an interesting, I've seen many paintings that feature the execution of Charles I outside the banqueting hall. And here you can see the hangman and his accomplice were masked, and we've never identified them with confidence. But here we also have Charles kind of, pictured in the foreground, but also pictured being executed. So this event haunted the Restoration. And when he was restored, Charles II promised to limit severe punishment of the 59 signatories of his father's death warrant. But the Stuart court could exact revenge in another fashion, which they did thoroughly by rubbing their old enemies' noses in their decadence. By the close of the decade, however, this form of revenge was beginning to pall on James. And turning to spiritual matters, he began reading a work by an Anglican divine named Reverend Peter Heylin, a disciple of Arminius and a favorite of Charles I. The title of the book was Ecclesia Restaurata, or The Church Restored, a history of the Reformation of the Church of England. Heylin gave an unvarnished depiction of Henry VIII's reasons for severing the English arm of the church from Rome. Ironically, the careful account of a Protestant minister spurred James to convert to Catholicism, and it produced a strange twinning effect between Henry VIII and James II in James's mind. Down the line, James would attempt to restore Catholic institutions wrecked by Henry, for example, the English chapter along of the Knights of Malta. So James was struck by the fact that Henry had not broken with Rome for theological reasons, which is that he could have respected. He perceived that Henry VIII had turned his country upside down for the forbidden love of a particular woman, the bewitching Anne Boleyn, in whom Henry saw the promise of complete renewal. James, a noted ogler who had also the habit of becoming passionately infatuated with maids of honor, saw himself mirrored in Henry VIII, and indeed he felt he saw right into the man's soul. It was a moment of recognition. He later wrote the following in a letter of advice to his son, Prince James Francis Edward, quote, I own with shame and confusion, I let myself go too much to the love of women, which for too long got the better of me, unquote. Once James had read Peter Heylin's book, he became preoccupied with healing the wound made by Henry. As to the problem of begetting a male successor, admittedly an important concern, James deemed Henry's strategy of replacing Catherine of Aragon with his mistress an unchristian shortcut, a form of crime, one could argue. As we know, Queen Catherine had given Henry a daughter, Mary Tudor. And this portrait of Mary Tudor was uncovered recently. It's a miniature, and I believe by Susanna Hornboat, showing a very, innocent and lovely young lady. This lady might have been married young to produce an heir for England if that was the true problem. That was an alternative strategy that was brought up more than once. But instead, this young princess, who longed for marriage and children, spent most of her fertile years essentially locked away because she remained fertile, because she remained loyal to her mother. But by the time she married Philip of Spain, she was already getting on a bit, especially by the standards of the day, and he was away a good deal. So it was not an easy prospect by any means for her to produce a child at that stage. James also noted that the Tudor king, having severed from Rome, then proceeded to loot the monasteries, another crime. And as we know, droves of those who resisted the great rupture wound up martyred. Monks, pilgrims of grace, prominent gentlemen like Sir Thomas More and Bishop Fisher. And moreover, James could discern a clear link between the dissolution and the judicial murder of Charles I. And I'll explain what I mean by that. To paraphrase G.K. Chesterton, one generation looted the church. Their descendants then turned and destroyed the monarchy. And a case in point is Oliver Cromwell, who was the great nephew of Thomas Cromwell. The land redistributed, that was my cat. Kitty, sorry. Sorry. My cat just knocked over a box. Kitty, no. Um, so the land redistributed to one generation gave political leverage to their Puritan descendants, the power they needed to depose the king. So it gave them political power because, of course, becoming an MP in those days, well, if you had a lot of land, that made it easier. This shift was incredibly significant because as things stood, James remained his brother's heir. So instinctively, James craved a full restoration of the old order to heal the rifts caused not only by civil war and regicide, but also religious rupture and dissolution. But could it be done in the 17th century context? So Peter Heylyn's book on the English Reformation sparked a transformation in James. He passed it on to his Duchess, Anne Hyde, pictured here, James and Anne Hyde, painted by Sir Peter Lely. Let's talk a bit more about Anne. Like Anne Boleyn, she had been a maid of honor. She was also a commoner. The daughter of Chancellor Edward Hyde, 1st Earl of Clarendon, Anne joined the train of James's sister, Mary, Princess of Orange, during the 1650s when the Stuarts were in exile. As a young lady, she had a rounded prettiness and was lively and sharp and totally loyal to the monarchy. In short, she was exactly the sort of woman that James and Charles favored. James and Anne were besotted, and Anne became pregnant. And just as Charles II was about to be restored, James promised to marry her. His family were opposed to this. They wanted a much grander match for him, ideally a foreign princess who could bring a great alliance, resources, and wealth to the table. Instead, James was proposing to marry a pregnant commoner with no particular riches to offer. Anne's own father, Edward Hyde, was so opposed to the marriage on political grounds that he declared she ought to be imprisoned in the Tower of London and even executed. But James pleaded with his brother, and Charles finally relented. Now, James's treatment of Anne reveals a great deal about his character. Yes, he was ruled by lust, but in a sense, he was also personally loyal and affectionate, and he did not have to stand up for Anne. He could have easily kept her on the side as a mistress. This is what his family and friends fully expected, in fact, but he did take her as his wife. Instead of sidelining Anne, he married her. Happily, Anne rose to the challenge as Duchess of York. In addition to giving him two daughters, Mary and Anne, she became a great patroness of painters like Sir Peter Lely. And this portrait, you notice, is almost exactly the same as the other one, except there are two little girls painted here, Mary on the left and Anne on the right, but they were added by a painter called Benedetto Gennari years later. Anne had the same response to Peter Heylyn's book. Soon, both Duke and Duchess were receiving instruction in the old faith. They each had a different a priest instructing them. They were received into the church in about 1670. King Charles had Catholic sympathies, but he knew that James's provocative decision would prove really provocative. Charles II, canny politician, insisted that the daughters remain Protestant. This created a bit of a gap between the parents and the daughters, especially over time. Once the news of James's conversion spread, elite resistance sprang up. A faction of Parliament introduced the Test Act, which required anyone in a position of influence to deny the true presence of our Lord in the Eucharist, and a wave of resignations followed. James, the target of the test, had to resign as Lord High Admiral, a post he had been bred to from a small child. He was actually appointed Lord High Admiral at the age of 4. The crucial point is that our modern party system, as I mentioned before, it originally took shape in response to James's conversion. Whig and Tory were both terms of abuse, Gaelic for cattle rustler and bandit, respectively. The Whig party now moved to exclude him from the succession, while the Tory party supported him in spite of his religion on legitimist grounds. Although there was widespread anti-Catholic bigotry, no law yet existed to preclude a Catholic from the throne. That would come later. James was the legitimate heir according to tradition, and that was good enough for the Tories. They were Anglicans, while the Whigs were generally nonconformist, dissenting Protestants. The Whigs displayed more Republican tendencies, favoring in particular a shift in sovereignty from monarch to parliament. And they were skilled at whipping up and making use of the London mob. From vulgus mobile, mob is a word which was also coined in this era to describe these very crowds. And in a sense, the English Civil War was playing out for a second time. James found it impossible to conceal his conclusions about the Catholic faith. It made sense to him, and he could not dissemble any more about it, even to please his family and a lot of the country. A number of Anglican divines sought to dissuade him, reminding him that his father was a martyr to Anglicanism. This was indeed a sore spot, and James treasured his father's memory, but he also knew that his father had left the door open to reunification, as we discussed. His mother, on the other hand, would certainly have been thrilled. Anne Hyde, meanwhile, wrote an account of her own conversion, which is interesting, and circulated it at court. His brother's frankness alarmed King Charles, and where do we have Charles, who was nothing if not a subtle politician. Charles always inclined towards their mother's faith, and indeed promised in a secret French treaty with Louis XIV that he would become a Catholic at some stage. However, he was in no hurry because he understood how English identity had been redefined as Protestant thanks to Henry VIII and Elizabeth I in particular. He also understood how skillful his enemies were at manipulating the public. Charles would wait until his deathbed to embrace the old faith, but James was too sincere a man and to hide the truth. That was his character. Happily for James, Charles would defend his brother's right to the throne through the turbulent decade of the 1670s, which culminated in the Popish plot hoax, which we have kind of laid out here, Popish damnable plot. This plot, or this fake plot, was targeted at James. When a strange character called Titus Oates approached the Whigs with stories about a Catholic plan, fake stories that later emerged, to poison King Charles and put James on the throne, they gladly embraced the narrative. Panic surged through London, and many Catholics were imprisoned and executed. Pamphleteers trumpeted that James would be a second Bloody Mary. Indeed, that particular moniker was popularized at this time. It was the exclusion crisis that gave us Bloody Mary. Yes, Fox criticized Mary heavily, and her reputation was, destroyed. But that term actually apparently didn't come around until much later. James and his second wife, Mary of Modena, had to go into exile, first in Flanders and then in Holland. And there James reigned as a kind of viceroy. Considering the sort of unrest that the Stuarts faced, it is remarkable that James became king at all. But by the early 1680s, Titus Oates and the Whigs had been discredited. So Titus Oates wound up in the stocks. Having lost patience with that turbulent faction, Charles actually dismissed Parliament and implemented a personal rule which echoed his father's for the remainder of his reign, something that is not often discussed. With the Royalist Tories on the rise, James was then called home from Scotland. In order to put their Protestant candidate, the king's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, on the throne, a circle of Whigs then attempted to murder Charles and James in an actual plot against the king's life. The Rye House plot failed, and the Stuarts consolidated their position. They enjoyed relative peace until 1685, when Charles II suffered a stroke, and James, kneeling at his brother's bedside, saw Charles refuse Anglican communion. He responded swiftly, "Shall I bring a priest, brother?" And Charles replied, "Yes, brother, do, and please make haste." What he did then, scouting out a Catholic priest to receive James in the king into the fold, was considered treason. But James was prepared to run that risk. It was another step to healing the rift made by Henry VIII. In an instance of blessed serendipity, the priest he returned with, Father John Huddleston, was known to Charles. Father Huddleston once helped to conceal Charles when he was on the run from Cromwell after the Battle of Worcester in 1651, the last battle of the English Civil Wars. The two spent long hours in a priest hide at Moseley Old Hall. Father Huddleston had bathed the fugitive's bleeding feet, and Charles had promised to help the recusants. Now the two were reunited. James told his dying brother, "This good man once saved your life. Now he comes to save your soul." The king made his confession, apologized to all he had harmed, and received the sacrament and last rites. Charles died shortly afterwards, and James was immediately proclaimed king. True to his word, Charles had become a Catholic, but at the last possible moment. Reading James's memoir, one is struck by Charles's plans to convert, actually. For example, he signed the Treaty of Dover. He had actually came to James before, telling him, he wanted to convert and how could they work this out. James's critics insist that he also should have waited to his deathbed to convert, but he was not a fox type elite. But in the terminology of foxes and lions, rather, he was a lion. In his first speech to Parliament, James II and Seventh stated frankly that he hoped the English people would follow his example and convert soul by soul. He hoped to effect this by means of attraction and not through compulsion. James knew how far the Protestant tendency had advanced in the population. He could not simply reverse Henry VIII's policy and Edward's as Mary had done. If she had had better fortune, likely England might still be Catholic today. James began practicing openly, building a new royal chapel, which was alongside or in addition to the Anglican one where Anne and others went to church. In an effort to restore the fortunes of Catholics who had suffered because of his conversion, he promoted some to key positions, which of course went over badly. Finally, he sought to introduce a broad religious toleration policy that would include not just Catholics, but also the whole range of Protestant dissenters, together with other faiths, although their numbers were small. By doing so, he was fully implementing the Restoration of 1660. His brother had promised a religious toleration for the sake of tender consciences. It had been blocked by Parliament. James, a convert himself and a great respecter of the human conscience, believed that Englishmen had a right to religious liberty provided that it did not challenge the sovereign power. Only a strong sovereign could ensure a coherent order under conditions of religious freedom, he believed. James distinguished between what he called mere religion, but by that he meant pure religion, just religious reasons, not a challenge to the state, such as the fierce challenge to the traditional constitution offered by the Puritans in the late 1640s. James went on a speaking tour with his close friend, the Quaker William Penn, to promote his toleration policy. And here, wrapping up, we circle back to James's encounter with Henry VIII, whose reasons for breaking with Rome had little to do with theology, mere religion. Indeed, instead, it was that shortcut to things that Henry sharply desired: a certain elusive woman, a male heir to strengthen the fledgling Tudor dynasty, and lucre. James's own longed-for princeling was born on June 10th, 1688. The boy displaced his Protestant half-sisters, Mary and Anne. The prospect of a Catholic dynasty sent the Whigs into another frenzy. A storm of mendacity broke out, with the king's enemies claiming that the boy was a changeling child, spirited into the queen's bed in a warming pan. Lines from the loyal poet laureate John Dryden, another convert to Catholicism, reproached those who have dared to cast shade, quote, "Born in broad daylight, that the ungrateful rout may find no room for a remaining doubt. Truth, which itself is light, does darkness shine, and the true eaglet safely dares the sun." But because the war against the church was so far advanced by then in these isles, the birth of a healthy and legitimate boy child, James Francis Edward, Prince of Wales, wound up toppling King James instead of securing his reign as Prince Edward had done for Henry VIII. James could never fully implement the restoration. Part of it, going back to 1660, was toleration. The other part was a son to secure it. But what happened next is a story for another day. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. Thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure that our audience will have questions. If you do have a question, please do type it in the chat box, which you'll find somewhere on your screen. Whilst you're doing that, I'll start off, if I may.
Okay.
You mentioned that you heard about James II when you were a student at university, and it was a very different perspective from the one you adopt now. What sort of inspired you to look into the life of James II personally?
Well, I am a convert myself. I converted when I was a long time ago now, but I'm a convert. And I was also a student of the 17th century. And I read a book by um, Belloc, which was the first account of James II that I'd ever heard that was warm and, understanding. And it was written in the 1930s. It was actually mentioned by a person who's no fan of James II, that is Winston Churchill. It indicated to me that the book, Belloc's book, had made a big splash. So I think that that got me curious about James and wanting to reassess him and wanting to defend him. And the more that I read about him and looked into and read his own memoirs, and the more I felt that this man had been vilified and sort of blackened, and that he's kind of used as like, why is Henry VIII the ultimate king, and James II, who, if you really look into it, didn't, you know, was not the grand oppressor that he's presented as. And this is kind of where I got going.
Thank you. We do have some questions.
Excellent.
Rune Larson has said that you spoke of James and Anne's Catholic chaplains during their catechesis. Were these chaplains brought from some noble estates where priests could be harbored, or were they brought from the continent?
No, I don't know the details about these. They both had English names. there were some Catholic priests in London, and they had a lot of them. There were some associated with Catherine of Braganza's court because she was queen at the time. It and when uh, so that way I would like to look a little further into them. I've tried to learn more about these two, but all I could get was their names, which I could come back to you with.
Thank you. Also, you mentioned James II built a Catholic Royal Chapel. Where was that chapel, and does the building still exist?
Was in Whitehall. It is doesn't exist as a Catholic chapel anymore. I think it's the fate of it was sacked, and as so many things were taken apart just after the Inglorious Revolution. I remember there's a very nice description of it by John Evelyn, who was no Catholic, but he was, of course, a great lover of culture, and so he was invited there by James and Mary of Modena and or Modena, as some say, um, and he was just so impressed with the statuary, and uh, it's, but unfortunately the artwork doesn't seem to have survived. But yeah, a lot of destruction was wrought on um, different Catholic chapels and institutions right after there was a riot. Although the the question of how popular or unpopular James was, I think, is not as obvious as people think. Like there, somebody else. What is it? Not my phone. Right, about that. Right, where was I talking about? Oh yes, popularity. So there was a riot after James left, but then there was also when one time he left and he came back. Like he tried to escape and then he came back. And when he came back into London, um, he was brought back by some pirates basically who captured him, and then they brought him back looking for a reward. When he came in, people realized the king was coming back. They were lighting bonfires, and a lot of people begged him to stay. So it wasn't sort of an open and shut thing like we're sometimes told. A lot of people did want James to actually fight on, um, but for reasons I could get into, but I won't perhaps, unless people really want to hear. I think his reasons for not fighting on are uh, interesting. But I think he did have some good reasons. For example, his father had been executed by these same sorts of people, the descendants of this same elite. He was worried about falling into their hands, and he said, "There's a short, a king in prison. There's a short line between that and him losing his head." Um, Another thing is, I think he didn't want the English Civil War to restart in England, although of course it wound up being fought in Ireland. Um, yes, I could say more.
I'm sure
Um,
having those sorts of experiences as a child must have been quite traumatic. There's another question here. Were certain people controlling the rejection of James? Can it be described as a conspiracy, or was it purely a countrywide reaction?
oh, it absolutely was a conspiracy. There was a group of, they have a very kind of self-regarding title. What are they called? Like the Magnificent Seven or something like that. But there's seven lords who were, uh, most of them were Whigs, but there were Tories as well. And they got together and wrote a letter to William of Orange inviting him to invade. So that's seven people. It wasn't even Parliament. It was just, a small group of important. It was an elite revolution. It was by no means a popular revolution. Really think that the populace, although of course, yes, anti-Catholicism like ran deep. I think that the people can be sort of guided. I think we're we're raised to think of revolutions as popular. If they've been successful, the people in power have an interest in presenting them as popular. The same is true of the French Revolution. But in fact, they're usually elite. They're usually organized by elites. It's a very organized elite or several sort of subgroups who get together and they are able to direct the energies of the populace, which is what happened to James all through the 1670s. We had the Whigs kind of whipping up these crowds, and they had all these terrible anti-Catholic parades, but this is London for one thing. It's not the whole country, um, and and but then when it burned out hard, and that's why James was eventually able to come to the throne quite smoothly. It's such a it's kind of a I think he really wanted to make, I mentioned he made these Catholic, appointments, putting Catholics into certain high offices, in part because he wanted to make up for all the people who, like a bunch of lords were executed because of the Popish plot, and he felt like, well, these people have been, horribly oppressed, and part of it is because of my conversion, that all this heat is on them because of my conversion. So he was kind of trying to even it out a bit by putting Catholics back in who had lost their positions because of the Test Act back into positions of power. Not all positions of power, but by the standards of the Whigs, any Catholic in any position of power was too much, right? I think he was unrealistic a bit. It's like with Charles was, you can argue this. I mean, Charles II was not as, his obviously um, his decision to wait until his deathbed was politically canny, but you can criticize you can call him insincere. But he did stay on the throne, whereas James was sincere and he wound up getting thrown off. But and also, he wanted to introduce this toleration. The problem was that he wound up alienating his political base because he'd been supported by the Anglican Tories on the grounds of legitimism, but he was saying, okay, we're going to open this up not just to Catholics, but also to all these Protestant dissenters who are your competition and who are here sort of undermining the Anglican Church, the nonconformists. And so, unfortunately, he was trying to, like, well, what we'll do is, we won't just favor Catholics. We'll favor everybody. We'll let everyone have religious freedom. But then this angered the very people who had been supporting him. So that's why you had a couple of Tories among the seven people who wrote the letter to William of Orange.
Our next question sort of leads on from that, I think. Was James II ever seriously proposing to bring back the Roman Catholic faith, or were the vested interests of the aristocracy and the bishops and parliament too deeply rooted in Anglicanism to make this possible in the way that Mary I had reintroduced Roman Catholicism?
I don't think he had a plan to formally reintroduce it. I think he was going for the he wanted to attract people to the faith. And, of course he wanted, and he openly said, of course, I want you all to be Catholics, right? Of course, I'm, sincere. I believe this is this is the right, this is the right faith, this is the true faith. Of course, I want that all for you, like a father, But I recognize, because he had this very sort of deep respect for the human conscience. And as I mentioned, he was good friends with the Quaker William Penn, and he did have this feeling that there shouldn't be any force when it came to religion, and he recognized that there was this. So he wanted to create the conditions for a larger conversion towards the Catholic faith, but he wasn't planning to he wasn't planning to just one day say, right, we're reintroducing it. That was possible for Mary, but and it wasn't that difficult for Mary, actually. It's just she also had some, misfortunes. Um, but just personal misfortunes. You know, she didn't have an heir. So, but for James, he knew that it, and I think he did have like a certain, like, you could call it liberalism. You know, he had a kind of liberalism in the sense that he had this respect for human conscience, and you know, he mentioned like Jews, and he even mentioned the Muslim faith in his toleration. So he did have this respect, but he held these two things side by side, that he was convinced of the truth of Catholicism, but he also respected the human conscience. However, his enemies, you know, he had a lot of evidence already of the virulence of his enemies, as this had been absolutely crazy. You know, the whole 1670s was just one long kind of freak out from the Whig faction. So he knew that. So I think he was a little a little unrealistic when it came to making these appointments. And, you know, he went toe to toe with when he tried to get the Anglican bishops to read out the toleration in church. Some of them rebelled against that, and then he had them, you know, he had them sent away, sent to prison, and then they went to court and they won, and there was like widespread celebration. So he wanted respect for the king, you know, the monarch's decisions, that he wasn't quite getting the kind of respect that he needed in order to push the toleration through. But you could see from their point of view that they were sort of being asked to cut off the branch they were sitting on, you know, like Anglican bishop reading out that from now on, all these small little Protestant groups will be able to practice with no problem. But another funny point is that down the road, a number of the same men who had said they refused, you know, fought with James over reading out the toleration, also refused to take an oath to William of Mary, because they were still had taken an oath to James II. So they became what was called the non-jurists. And the the Archbishop of Canterbury was one of them. So they had to bring in someone else to um, to do the coronation when it came to William and Mary. But there's something very, I don't know. I really think the institutions were kind of discredited in a way after that, because of this obvious, you know, this obvious sort of dethroning of a legitimate king. Even though some people might have wanted it, they felt there wasn't a lot of respect um, for William and Mary in certain quarters. And the Jacobite cause through the 1690s, it really could have gone either way. There were many rebellions, many pro-Jacobite crowds, lots of English Jacobites. People don't realize how popular Jacobitism was in England as well as Scotland and Ireland.
Thank you. One last question then. What were the motives of the seven men who wrote to William? Were they worried by financial anxieties, or was it just a religious distaste?
They dressed it up as you know, there was this cry, religion, liberty, and property, I think. That was a that they often kind of mentioned those three. I think that there was always a kind of nervousness going back to the dissolution. And you know, you might think it was unrealistic all these years later, but there was always a nervousness. I think the reason they mentioned property, I think one of the reasons at least, was that they were always worried that those lands, church lands, were going to get taken back. And that, you know, that they had an association in their minds between, as a result, they had an association in their minds between, you know, security of property and this potential, you know, if the Catholic faith came back, these things might be up in the air. Well, the fact is, Mary the First, she didn't give back church lands, but still, it was something that people worried about. They mentioned religion, but I'm not convinced that a lot of these people were. We were already getting into a phase where Skepticism was religious skepticism was trendy among elites. You already have this kind of libertinism kicking in. I'm not saying they were all, they were all sort of, skeptics or atheists or something, but I do think that was beginning to be fashionable. And there were a lot of them that also, to be fair to them, there were a lot of people who were tired of, the constant religious conflict. So they were kind of entertaining other models that would put those, you know, concerns aside. I think Lord Bolingbroke was one who was, that his his agnosticism, let's say, was kind of founded on that weariness with the conflict. But I don't believe that these people were incredibly, concerned about Protestantism. I think it had a lot more to do with financial concerns. And they talked of and just with Parliament's power, because James did have what, enemies call absolutism, but really, I mean, when you think back to the kings and the arrangement of kings and parliament prior to the 17th century, well, I mean, Henry VIII ruled the roost. Elizabeth I only called parliament 4 or 5 times, I believe. Parliament was supposed to be an advisory body. Yes, they also voted you taxes and so forth, money for wars and so forth. But this real clash between the power of the monarch and the power of parliament, this only came around in the 17th century. So James wanted to recover that sort of um, old model of the monarch and respect for the monarch, but he wasn't getting it. So that was another factor, was that they were kind of they wanted to see this sovereignty pass firmly into Parliament's hands, and that's what happened. I mean, William of Orange was a fairly strong leader, but once the Hanoverians came in, it was absolutely clear that Parliament ruled, right?
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Justine, for your fascinating talk.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you, everyone, for attending the talk this
Yeah.
evening.
Do you mind
I
if I
will.
just butt in there, William, for a second? I just thought I'd mention the result of the so-called Glorious Revolution resulted in the 1701 Act of Settlement, which of course linked the monarchy with the Church of England in a way that it still is to this very day. So that the
Yes,
monarchs, even today, in our day and age, has to be a communicant member of the Church of England and is officially the Supreme Governor of the said Church of England. There are many of us, of course, who would prefer if that link was broken, and this Act of Settlement of 1701 was definitely off the statute book. But, however, that is unfortunately the case. As a result of that, the Church of England's sort of establishment fixed itself permanently as it thought to the monarchy as a result of the so-called Glorious Revolution. But that's an echo of it for today, really, isn't it?
absolutely. Yes. Yeah. No, we're still living in the settlement, and we're still living in the sort of structure, the sort of historical structure as well, the kind of notion of progressive historical structure whereby the powers of the monarch fall away, and one could, you know, but yes, but that's why I say that we're kind of James is having been dethroned in the way that he was. This kind of idea that no, the traditional succession is no longer applies. The king doesn't just automatically become the king. It's Parliament that has to invite him or decide, and Parliament can just randomly choose somebody else, which they did. They're certainly in the case of the House of Hanover. I mean, Mary and William. Mary was in line to the throne, but Prince James Francis, as a male, he superseded Mary. So Mary wasn't a nobody; she didn't come from nowhere, and William, neither. But the fact that Parliament could say, right, we've decided James is abdicating. He never did. They refused to read out his letter explaining why he'd done what he'd done, and that he's prepared to come back and so forth, right? They wouldn't read it out, and they also filled, the city with Dutch troops as well, intimidating people in terms of their vote.
It was a real point of change in society constitutionally, very much so, I think so, and gives us the constitutional settlement in a way that we have today, really, as a result.
Yes. And because it is it was a trick in a way, it was something like, oh, okay, we're just switching out the old order. I think that's why I say James is swept under the carpet, because it's an awkward fact, that the king was deposed the way he was.
On largely religious grounds.
Yeah.
Excellent. Just to remind everybody of our annual general meeting and day conference is coming up in a few weeks' time on Saturday, 1st of November, at Our Lady and St Gregory's Church at Warwick Street, Soho, starting at 11 a.m. or meeting just before that in the church there. And there'll be tea and coffee available. Bring your own sandwiches, excellent speakers, mass at 12 o'clock, ordinary at rite, and annual general meeting, and then hopefully a social event afterwards, which is what we're hoping for as well. So everybody is welcome. Bring a friend, bring somebody or other. It's all on the website, all the costs and everything else, but do come along if you can.
That sounds brilliant.
Well, thank you very, very much. And the full details of our remaining talks for this year are also on the website. If you do want to come to the annual general meeting and day conference, please do let us know. And the full details of how to do that are on our English Catholic History Association website. And please do consider joining the association if you've enjoyed the talk and you're not already a member. The talks don't happen for free, and we can carry on doing what we do with your support as members. But thank you again, Justine, and thank you all very much. Good night.
Thank you, William.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justine.